Hey, good morning. So glad to see you here today. I'm Kitty Shidana. I'm co-chair of the Asian American Alumni Association of Princeton, or A4P DC. We're just so glad that you're here at the closing session of our 2016 Summer Seminar Series on Civic Engagement by the Asian Pacific American Community. This is our fourth event, and the purpose is to dig into specific issues and to open conversations so that we hope that they will continue to intrigue you and engage you, and that you will in turn engage others well into the future. The series is organized by A4P DC under the umbrella of the Princeton Club of Washington, with support from the Association of Princeton Graduate Alumni, the Association of Black Princeton Alumni, and the Office of Alumni Affairs of Princeton University. In a time of sizzling politics where polarizing rhetoric predominates over substance, we need to find more ways to bridge across differences by promoting dialogue and understanding, including within and across the APA community. We selected topics and speakers who can broaden and deepen our understanding on the issues affecting our population, and we're bringing together academics with policymakers and practitioners because we want to see how theory track with reality and how we can in turn shape our own realities and write our own narrative well into the future. Again, we're so delighted to have so many of you join us today. I want to note the generous financial support of several organizations that made this possible. DSFederal-IDEA Foundation, that allowed us to professionally videotape the entire series and make it available, and we're already seeing many uptake of people who are viewing the videos of the previous sessions. And Sophia Parker, the president and CEO of DS Federal and the IDEA Foundation, is with us today. Thank you, Sophia. The International Leadership Foundation for underwriting the participation of their interns and advisors, many of whom, including Rose Lee, is with us today. And then we also have other sponsors who contributed towards general operations support, including Seven Seas Restaurant, the Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs of the Greater DC Chapter, Korean Business Enterprise, and the Maryland International Development Center, the Lee Educational Foundation, and AA Lead. Thanks also to National Capital Contracting, to each of you. And you have done just a marvelous job with the video recordings of the last three sessions, and it's just delightful to work with you on this one as well. And I want to note special thanks to Dora Chen, who is a Princeton student and who has been with us in all four events and greeted each participant with warmth and grace. Really just delightful for us to see your face first thing in these early mornings. So with that, I am going to turn over to A4P DC co-chair Rose Lee, who is going to introduce today's speakers. I want to very clearly say that she is the force behind the series. Rose is that rare combination of a leader who has both great vision as well as the ability to notice and think about and tend to every detail. It's a joy and honor to work with Rose and to be part of this series.
So good morning. I'm delighted to join Kitty in welcoming you to the final seminar in our summer series on Asian Americans and civic engagement. We did it. It's been a long journey to do 4 of these in the dead of summer, trying to get people to come and pay attention. So thank you for coming and making the time. I'm very excited to hear from today's speakers. We've all heard that by 2040, the number of Asian American voters in the United States is expected to double. Demography is destiny. And there's probably no two people in this region better able to tackle the topic of the future of the Asian American electorate and our growing influence than the two speakers who we have invited to speak today. Janelle Wong is a professor of American Studies and the director of the Asian American Studies program at the University of Maryland. Her research on race, immigration, and political mobilization has most recently resulted in groundbreaking national study on Asian American political attitudes and behavior. She's a former fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and she authored the book, Democracy's Promise: Immigrants and American Civic Institutions. Apart from her contributions in academia, Janelle has contributed pieces for NBC News, AAPI Voices, and Asian Fortune News. Mark Keam serves in the Virginia House of Delegates and is very active in the AAPI community nationally in both the political and nonprofit sectors. He's one of those rare politicians who is thoughtful, who builds bridges instead of walls, and makes the ladder sturdier for those seeking to climb up behind him. He's really like a big brother to many of us novices in the political arena, actually a force behind the scenes that is making all these things happen. We're just delighted to have him join us to help moderate today's session and share his insights about what is going on in this region and in the country more generally. Mark.
Well, first of all, good morning, everyone. It is great to see all of you. As somebody who went to public schools all my life out in the West Coast and coming to the U.S. as a young teenager that didn't speak English that well, I'm really excited today because this is the closest I'll ever be to Princeton. So my mom will be very, very proud knowing that I was associated with Princeton. But I want to first thank Rose for your very kind remarks and for coming up with this idea. This is a great, fantastic idea, an opportunity for us to get together and have these conversations. So I want to thank you for your leadership. I also want to thank Kitty, who I've known for a long time, about 20 years or so. She and I were part of a leadership program here in Washington, D.C. called the Leadership Greater Washington, which is a way to bring some of the mainstream leaders from corporate, public, nonprofit, government sectors together for a year-long leadership development program, and that's how we got to know each other. Sadly, when we were part of the program, we were the only Asian Americans in the group of about 30 or 40 people. But this is one of the topics that we'll address today in terms of our lack of visibility, but it's good to see Kitty again. And for all of you, especially for all of our corporate sponsors, thank you so much for sponsoring this. This is a small but a start of a longer, much more important conversation that Rose and Kitty have started, and I hope that this becomes a yearly, if not a more routine opportunity. And for those who are able to put some seed funding into this, we really appreciate this, because without your support, we wouldn't be able to have these gatherings, not only today, but the last 3 other times as well. So I want to thank you for that. I want to start by asking a few questions, which I think all of us should be asking ourselves every single day. And it's particularly relevant now in light of what's happening in the national environment. We all know that the presidential campaigns are very heated. It's becoming a little bit more controversial than we are used to, and it's becoming a lot more partisan and more divisive than we're used to. And it certainly is not surprising that more Americans are paying more attention to election cycles this year. And one of the, I guess if you want to call it a benefit, one of the side benefits of the fact that people are looking at this election so closely, the media, the pundits, the pollsters, the politicians, the candidates, grassroots, one of the nice things about the fact that everybody's scrutinizing this election is because it's going to be such a close election, regardless of which candidate you choose, it is going to be a very close election. And it's also going to be an election where the contrast is so big on the two sides that people are looking for every single advantage they can possibly find to put their candidate above the other. And so it's not the traditional, oh boy, the blue states will vote blue, Republican states will vote Republican, and you got 3 states in the middle and the swing votes, and let's see who turns out the swing votes. It's not as simple as that anymore. It's a question of which blue states could possibly become red, which red states can possibly become blue, and which states that are reliably one way or another might have some, within its state, constituencies that normally vote one way might come out the other way. And in that conversation that you're hearing across the country and on the Sunday talk shows, you certainly hear a lot about the angry white male vote. That's something that's become a hot topic now that we haven't heard in about 25, 40, 30 years. But the idea that angry white men are now driving the conversation one way or another, and which is the reason why Donald Trump did so well in his primary and now as a nominee, and which is also the reason why Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine spent the first 3 or 4 days after their convention in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt, in Pennsylvania and Ohio, specifically to target that demographic. And then you hear, of course, the conversation about the Latinos and how they respond to what Mr. Trump has said earlier in the year, and the idea of the need for comprehensive immigration reform at the same time, possibly slowing down and putting some obstacles in further immigration. So that's become a hot topic. And so people are focusing a lot on the Latinos and especially Mexican Americans. And earlier in the year, when you had Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio in the race, people were very focused on the Cuban American vote, in particular among the Latino votes, to see if they might vote differently because of the fact that they have more Republican constituencies. And then, of course, you had this year, one of the unique conversations that has come up, especially since last week, is the idea that Muslim Americans and those of different faiths other than Christian and Judeo-Christian traditions in America are now being targeted in ways that were not the same in the last 15 years since 9/11, and in particular that Muslim Americans feel that their existence in the United States and the legitimacy of their religion is now being questioned by at least one political party, and as a result, they're trying to identify a way for them to express their outlets. And you saw that clearly last week at the Democratic Convention, where one of the gentlemen who a Muslim American who happens to be a Virginian who lost his son in the most tragic way possible, defending our nation, became a speaker. And the first time that a Muslim American played a prominent role in the National Convention. And that, of course, has led now to this day, this long conversation about what it means for a Muslim American, what it means for Americans of all backgrounds to be participating. All that is to say that the one voice that we have not heard a lot about, one constituency that we haven't seen a lot of dialogue and scrutiny, is ours, the Asian American Pacific Islanders. Now, because people like me tend to pay attention to our community a lot more than other people, we're excited. This is the first time, at least in my lifetime of working on campaigns for almost 30 years, that we saw a number of Asian Americans playing a major highlighted role at both conventions. At the Republican convention, we had a doctor from New Mexico, Dr. Lisa Shin, I think it is. I can't remember her name, but she's a Korean American who started the Korean Americans for Trump, and she had primetime speaking opportunity where she had a chance to, put her Asian American face in the middle of the conversation. And that, even though I might not agree with her politics, I was very proud to see an Asian American face, a very, very articulate spokesperson for that cause on TV. Likewise, on my side of the aisle as a Democrat, at the Democratic Convention, we saw, for the first time in history, not just one, but several members of Congress who are Asian American by ethnicity, all speaking about Asian Americans and specifically talking about how with the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Japanese internment and other unfortunate stains that we've had in our nation, that has now backlashed to a point where Asian Americans are now stepping up and engaging in the civil process. And so to see people like Judy Chu and Grace Meng and Ted Lieu and others stepping up and speaking, not as just another politician, but talking about their Asian American ethnicity and our cultural aspect of it, that was also a very positive thing. And what we've also seen now is some press, at least for the last 6 months or so, has started paying attention to Asian American voters. And the tagline that's come out a few times, I've now heard this a few times, is the Asian American vote used to be the marginal vote. Now it's becoming the margin of victory vote. And to the extent that it is becoming that, this might be an opportunity for us as Asian Americans to move forward. And so today, I wanted to introduce Janelle Wong here, who's going to be presenting to you the stats and the data. But as we think about these numbers and the great research that she's done, I want us to ask ourselves one core question. If America is about participatory democracy, right? The concept of America is that we all participate and individuals make up the collective whole. If that's what we believe in, and if Asian Americans are in fact fast growing, and in fact we are present here, and we are going to be here for a long, long time, and we're going to be continuing to grow, are we today getting our fair share in the public sector, meaning government and policy making, political elected office, and also in the private sector, meaning your jobs, your small business opportunities, your contracting, your affirmative action at schools, your buying, purchasing power from the corporations? Are we in fact representing ourselves at the right ratio? Are we getting our fair share? If yes, that's great. How do we get there? And if not, why not? And how do we get to that stage where we truly become part of the American fabric? So I think that's going to be the underlying question that we should be asking ourselves, not just in politics, even though that's what I happen to be in, but also in the business side, because as you might know, Asian Americans are predicted to estimate it in the next 2 years to be able to expand a $1 trillion purchasing power. We're a small 6% of the nation, and yet our purchasing power economically is going to reach 1 trillion, which is more than the other 2 ethnic minority groups combined. So if that's the case, are we truly, in fact, meeting our goals and getting back our fair share, both in the public and the private sector? So that should be the underlying question that we have. But to start that conversation, I want to turn this over to Dr. Wong, who's going to give us a presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. I'd also like to thank Rose and Kitty for organizing this series, and thank you, Mark, for the introduction. Thanks to those of you who have helped to volunteer to make this this series possible. It's really nice also to see so many faces early in the morning. Thanks for coming out for civic engagement. So I'm going to talk about the stats and the data, like Mark said, and hopefully we can have a conversation after this about some of the things that I'll be presenting. So is this working? Okay. So let me first just ask you a question. I'm going to kind of set the context with some questions about immigration. Raise your hand. Is immigration to the U.S. increasing, A, increasing, B, decreasing, or C, leveling off? Increasing, decreasing, leveling off. In fact, it's leveling off. We have seen since 2008, immigration is leveling off. Immigrants are becoming a precious commodity in this nation. And another aspect of immigration that has changed dramatically is that immigration from Mexico is declining. So here you see in this slide that since the Great Recession, immigration from Mexico has been on the decline, including unauthorized immigration. And in fact, net migration since the Great Recession has actually been negative. So take that in as you think about the current immigration debate. Okay, immigration to the United States is mainly from which countries? Mostly from Asia, Latin America, or Africa? Asia, Latin America, Africa. It's true that most of the foreign-born in the U.S. continue to be Latino because of past historic immigration trends. But since 2011, the largest group of immigrants entering the United States is from Asia. So over the past years, that group has mainly been dominated by the Chinese. This is likely not to continue. In fact, Indians are expected to be the largest Asian immigrant group going into the future because of both political trends in India and birth rates. So what do we see? We actually see this tremendous growth that every presenter has talked about because Asian Americans are changing the U.S. Demographic landscape. We see these are growth rates. So what we're seeing here is huge growth rates compared to the general U.S. population. That last bar, 60%, there's still a really small part of the general U.S. population, but is biracial or multiracial Asians. So they're the fastest growing, though they still constitute a very small part of the population. And where are Asian Americans growing fastest? Yes, Asian Americans tend to be growing at a steady rate and tend to have very large populations on the West and East Coast. But where we see Asians growing fastest are places like Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, New Hampshire. What are these? Swing states, right? Presidential swing states. So notice Virginia's not on this list, but let's talk about Virginia. Virginia, and these statistics are thanks to Karthik Ramakrishnan and APGA Vote. Virginia's Asian American population has grown 96% since 2000. The growth rate of eligible Asian American voters was 4 times greater than Virginia's overall eligible voter growth rate. So this is a state definitely to pay attention to. The largest groups in Virginia: Indians, Filipinos, Chinese, and Koreans, in that order. Plus, Virginia has Delegate Mark Keam, a big mobilizing force in Virginia. Okay, so we're growing fast. We're starting to have some impact in swing states. Let's do a reality check on our rates of political participation and engagement. Here, this is 2012, and these are turnout rates, and this is adult citizens. So these are eligible voters, adult citizens, okay? Asian Americans clock in at the lowest voting rates, 47% compared to 66% for Black Americans. It's not just voting. Even the kinds of political participation that don't require citizenship necessarily, that don't have the same kind of eligibility requirements as other kinds of participation, we still lag in terms of contacting elected officials, attending a political meeting, contributing to campaigns. And this is even more of, I think, a concerning trend. If we look at youth engagement, so these are young Asian Americans who've grown up in the United States. They are citizens. They are eligible to vote. They don't face necessarily the same kind of language barriers or other kinds of lack of socialization into the political system as others. Asian Americans are second to Latino Americans in terms of what researchers call civic alienation. That is, they don't participate in any kind of political activity. I dug deeper into this. Asian American young people have the most access to the internet of any racial and ethnic group. They actually are online for a longer amount of time and doing more stuff online than any other American group, but they participate politically online less than every other group. So they have access. They are online, but they are not engaging politically online. And that is a concern. Why is that? It's actually still a mystery. This is something that my colleagues and I are studying this year because it's actually still a mystery. Part of it, it's not just culture. It's also the fact that people participate because their parents participate. And so there's a gap there. And I think we need to recognize that structural gap in the community. So why aren't Asian Americans participating? A lot of people think it is some kind of cultural disposition, but I want to shift your thinking to other kinds of factors that might be impacting low rates of participation. Even though Asian Americans are growing fastest in the swing states, they still are half as likely to live in the swing states as other groups. Okay, so what does that mean? In a presidential election, they are not getting targeted. They are not getting mobilized by the political parties. Survey after survey shows that Asian Americans are much less likely to be contacted by the political parties than other groups. So don't just look at, oh, is it that Asian Americans don't care about politics? I don't think that's true. You see around the world, Asians are pretty politically involved. So it's really that they're not getting mobilized, and that's partly structural. They don't live in those competitive states in very large numbers. They still, as Mark said, are only 6% of the population. So they're still, by political party standards, a relatively small part of the electorate. And many are not affiliated with a political party. So Asian Americans and Latinos are more likely to say that they don't affiliate with any party. That could mean they're a great kind of group to go after to get votes, but it also means that political parties with scarce resources are afraid to mobilize people they're not sure are going to vote for them. They're not a sure thing. In these kinds of elections, high propensity voters who have a long history of voting for your party, those are the gold mine for many political parties. And finally, lower registration rates. This is still kind of a mystery. Why? We can understand that the voting rates are low because the registration rates are low. Once Asian Americans register to vote, they actually vote at rates that are very similar to the general population. And let me emphasize that. Once registered to vote, Asian Americans vote at rates very similar to the general population. So the real barrier here is mobilization and registration. And here you see the effects of that really we're 6% of the population, we are 3% of the American electorate. So what can we do? The strategy is relatively simple in some ways, which is everyone is talking about registration right now, the 100 days before the election. But really, registration and mobilization are something that Asian American organizations and civil rights organizations and voting rights organizations need to be doing year-round, every year, between elections. This is what we have learned from other groups. In terms of vote choice, yes, most Asian Americans, a plurality of Asian Americans don't identify with one of the major parties. But among those that do, and including those who don't, they actually are trending dramatically Democratic. So if you look at that dark red line, that is the trend of Asian Americans voting for the Democratic candidate over the last 20 years. In 2012, Asian Americans voted for Obama at a slightly higher rate, statistically insignificant, but at a slightly higher rate than Latinos. So we are a pretty big Democratic bloc for going into the future. This is a crazy election. We're not sure how things are going to go, but we have seen steady growth of Asian Americans toward the Democrats. In fact, unnoticed in 2012, Asian Americans voted for Obama at a higher rate than Latino Americans. And yet, we're kind of a hard population to nail down politically. Why? Diversity is the hallmark of the Asian American population, right? One of the things that really makes this community stand out is the fact that there are so many different kinds of national origin groups, religious groups, language groups. It's hard to figure out, well, what does draw us together, right? If you think about different kinds of things, culture is made up of, let's say, religion, language, foodways. What do we share in common? We have one of the most diverse language groups, one of the most diverse religious groups, and sometimes people like to say, well, what brings us together is educational values. Well, every group in the United States values education, right? This is not something that is necessarily unique to Asian Americans. We've seen data that show that in terms of educational values, Latinos, for instance, express a higher level of believing that college is important for success in life than Asian Americans. So every group really does value education, though their access may be different. So let's look at the policy issues that might constitute an Asian American political agenda. Here we see some statistics from 2012, the last presidential election. 50% of Asian Pacific Americans support the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, versus about 40% of Americans generally. Asian Americans have a high degree of support for universal health care. 60% of Asian Americans favor protecting the environment over economic growth versus 40% of Americans generally. Do you ever hear about the Asian American environmentalists? And yet a lot of Asian Americans actually do self-select that title. If you ask people, would you identify as an environmentalist? A larger proportion of Asian Americans than other groups say they are environmentalists. 65% favor taxing the rich to provide a middle-class tax cut. This is not different from the US population. This is the same. But 80% of Korean Americans, who are often stereotyped as being economically conservative on tax policy because of high rates of business ownership, 80% favor this tax cut, raising taxes on the rich to provide a middle class tax cut. On immigration, of course, Asian Americans are the group with the largest number of immigrants. About 70% of Asian American adults are immigrants, right? Versus 40% of Latinos are immigrants. So they're actually a majority US born population. But Asian Americans don't look necessarily different on immigration policy. About 60% favor a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, even though about 10% of the Asian American population are undocumented. Also, in 2012 and 2016, contrary to some of the, I think, press, the majority of Asian Americans, and this is a very recent survey, support affirmative action in higher education admissions. Now, there are variations. Chinese are the group least likely to support affirmative action in higher education. So what's going on in Asian America as we approach the 2016 election? Here's the candidate choice. We are still seeing some uncertainty, I think, that Asian Americans are not supporting Trump at high numbers. You can see these numbers, that third column. No Asian American group is showing strong support for Trump, even though there's been, I think, some pretty interesting press stories showing there's like some Asian American groups, Koreans for Trump, Chinese for Trump. In fact, if we do a survey that's not quite representative, but close to representative of registered voters, we see they're leaning Democrat. But look at this someone else column at the end. Who's that someone else? Asian Americans are partly choosing that, I think, because they're not certain about who's running. They're still trying to get comfortable with the political system, right? And so this is a group that actually could benefit a lot from talking about politics, from more voter education. Reaction to the anti-immigrant rhetoric that Mark was referencing before among Asian American registered voters. They were asked, would you vote for another candidate if the candidate that you are currently supporting exhibited anti-immigrant rhetoric? What we see here is a big chunk would vote for someone else, but there's some variation in the population. Chinese are the most likely group to stick with their candidate, even if anti-immigrant rhetoric is exhibited. Reaction to anti-Muslim rhetoric among Asian American registered voters. Many Asian Americans, the biggest plurality, would actually switch candidates if anti-Muslim rhetoric were exhibited. However, look at the Chinese. The Chinese are the most likely to stick with their candidate. And this is a surprise because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Asian Americans and Chinese Americans have actually experienced exclusion based on a kind of ascriptive characteristic. And yet they're still the group in Asian America most likely to endorse exclusion based on an ascriptive characteristic. It is shocking, but it is something that is happening in our community that we need to think about. Okay, switching to some other policies that have been in the news. Asian Americans are one of the groups that is, in fact, most opposed to liberalized gun laws. So Asian Americans as a whole, 77% believe that stricter gun laws are needed in the US. That is something that really distinguishes Asian Americans as a whole, and you can see this across all of the different groups. Raising the federal minimum wage. 73% of Asian Americans agree with raising the federal minimum wage, and you don't see a lot of uncertainty on these issues. Asian Americans seem to get it, and they feel pretty strongly about it. Right? Oops, sorry. Okay, this is something that I think very few people pay attention to, but is a consistent characteristic in the population. In 2012, Asian Americans and other Americans were asked, do you favor a bigger government with more services or a smaller government with fewer services? Asian Americans, this is the best sample of Asian Americans I have ever seen. It was done so carefully that I really think that this is something real in our population. I've seen other surveys that are consistent with this. Asian Americans, 55% say that they favor a bigger government with more services versus 40% of the general US population, right? And this, you can see across groups, is fairly consistent. Korean Americans, 68% favor a bigger government with more services versus a smaller government with fewer services. Vietnamese, who tend to be the most Republican in our community, 70% favor a bigger government with more services versus a smaller government with fewer services. So what is going on here? This is an interesting issue because this is an issue that actually is a distinguishing marker among the two parties, right? Their attitudes about the role of government in everyday life. So let me leave you with these take-homes. There is tremendous growth, including in the swing states and in localities. So I didn't talk about that much, but what we're seeing is we're seeing more and more local jurisdictions that have 5% or 10% Asian American population that can, in fact, make a difference. I think we'll see Asian Americans making a difference most, not in the swing states, obviously, but in state and local elections. There they can play a really important role. At the same time, there are still real challenges to participation and engagement. But these are not necessarily the challenges of culture or attitude. These are partly structural challenges that have to do with where the population is concentrated, the size of the population, and the partisanship of the population. The fact that sometimes parties don't see the Asian American population as one to target because they're not certain which direction they'll necessarily vote. Year-round engagement, I think, is the answer. We cannot only be paying attention to Asian Americans in the 2 months before an election. They really need to be mobilized throughout the year consistently in off years. And finally, it's time to think about what is the Asian American political agenda. We have not developed a strong political agenda as a community yet. And I think it's partly because we're not sure what we agree on. There's a lot of variation in the community. I've shown you some trends. Are these the things that the Asian American community will coalesce around? One of the things we don't know is how important relative to other issues are the issues I've shown you here today. And then a big question. Shockingly, could Asian Americans be the next big government voting bloc? This is not the stereotype of the Asian American community, but it is something that separates the Asian American community from the rest of the American electorate. What do we make of that? How should we think about that going into the future? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Wong, for the very fascinating set of data as well as a narrative that's behind the data, and this gives us a lot to think about. Obviously, we don't have a lot of time, so we can't spend the whole day talking about this. But if I was a professor like she is, I would ask you all to do a homework assignment and turn in a paper by next week that explains your reactions to this. But since we can't do that, I'm going to turn this over to all of you very soon with your questions. So please start thinking about your questions, comments, whatever you want to share in this in this conversation here. Would like to do that. But let me just add a couple more thoughts to this, and then we'll open this up. First of all, I think the snapshot that she presented, both the demographic changes, what we expect happening in the future in light of the fact that we are still immigrating, and the type of policy issues that are on the minds of many of us, and the lack of outreach by the political parties and the candidates, I think that all tells you that we are still on our way to the place as opposed to being there. And I've heard a lot, I was at the Democratic Convention last week, And a lot of my good friends on my side of the aisle are very excited because, as I said earlier, we're now finally visible. We're on stage. There's press attention and so on. But we're just starting to arrive. We're not quite there yet. We're not quite there at the table yet. And to the extent that the number of Asian Americans around the country and the lack of numbers at the congressional level and even at the state level, we're not quite there yet. So the question that comes to my mind is, this is all good. This is all great in terms of understanding the snapshot. But is the general trend positive, or is it negative? Or perhaps, is it leveling off? So that would be the first question I'd have. And let me just do a little quick survey here, because I know everybody likes to do these surveys in presidential time. Right track, wrong track. Looking at the stats that we've seen in terms of the demographic changes, the fact that we're highly educated, possibly more wealthy in terms of the average than the other ethnic minority groups, the fact that I mentioned earlier about our purchasing power being up to $1 trillion for the small population that we are. Do you all think, just kind of sitting here without doing a lot of analysis, do you all think that Asian Americans are on the right track when it comes to us getting our fair share, however way you define that, in America, or do we have a long way to go? So how many people think we're on the right track? A couple, three, some optimists. How about, are we on the wrong track, meaning we're just not doing anything positive, we're not quite there yet, we're still way behind? Wrong track? Or are other people kind of ambiguous? Okay, that's good to know. That's one of the baseline questions that every candidate always asks before they run for office. Are things going well? If that's the case, then do I really want to be out there challenging the system? Are things going really bad? In which case, yeah, anybody should come in and try to, offer different opportunities. So right track, wrong track is always a good question. My personal view is that we're certainly heading in the right direction, especially from where we came in the last 150, 200 years. We're certainly heading in the right direction. But should we be a lot further than we are now? Absolutely. And I think that's really should be the baseline. And the second part I just want to open this up with, and I'd love to hear your question, is there have been a ton of research over the last 10 years or so, and Dr. Wong has done a great job in presenting some of her research as well as some of the key conversation pieces. But there have been a lot of research done on Asian Americans, and in particular on things like Nielsen has done a research on the consumer aspect of it, the trends. You mentioned the Asian Americans tend to be more in the internet, and they tend to be more consumer-oriented in terms of their purchasing. And then the generational language gaps. The APGA Vote, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, does a lot of research on what are some of the hot topics that Asian Americans care about, such as immigration and such. And the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, which is a national civil rights umbrella organization, they issue a lot of demographic papers that show that the South, Virginia and further south, 11 states that make up the South, is actually the fastest growing. We grew by 46% in the last 10 years versus 43%, which is what the Latino Americans have grown. And so that also has a lot of other information and data that you should be looking at, in addition to all the other research that's been done. But all that points to the fact that even though we are on the verge of getting there, we've been invited to the party, at least some of us have been, and we're trying our best to open the doors for everyone. We still need a lot of basic education. It's almost like starting from scratch. I mean, some of us who happen to be in politics, or some of us who are business or entrepreneurs, have figured out the secret sauce. You figured out how to do it. You're there. You're doing well. But the rest of them have no clue whatsoever. It's not even like they say, okay, well, I've seen you do it, now I'm about to do it myself. It's like, how in the world did you do that? Because nobody's ever taught me how to do it. So there's almost this elementary baseline that's missing. And so to the extent that we need infrastructure, whether it's educational forums like this, seminars, mentoring, organizations, academic programs that really teach the basics of civic participation, basics of entrepreneurship, basics of getting involved in the American system, basics of learning English and participating at the local level, I think there's still a real big need for that. And perhaps that might be one reason why so many Asian Americans express that their interest in a big government. I hate the word big government, but I think the idea of big government is that they need somebody to give them a pathway. They need somebody to hold their hand and walk them through. And that somebody isn't usually your neighbor and your local small business. And so they turn to the government, because most of the Asian Americans who came here from another country are used to the government taking care of everything for them. Licensing, housing, home, welfare, public services. So they're used to having the government be the entity that helps you with these things. And so maybe that's part of the explanation for why Asian Americans feel like, boy, life is really hard for me. I just need somebody to help me. Hey, government, can you help me? And so maybe that's one of the ways that they turn to Obamacare for health care, they turn to welfare programs, they turn to language programs, they turn to business opportunities like SBA and other small business organizations. So that might be a way to explain that. But I want to start with that because I want to hear from all of you. How much do you agree with the stats and research? How much of this is enlightening? And what are some of the surprising moments? And what are some of the things you said, wow, I always thought that, but now that you've got the data to prove it, that really makes a lot of points. So let me start with that. I'm going to turn from left to right, go around, Q&As. Don't be so Asian. Put your hands up and come on up. Do we want to do the microphone here? Okay. So whoever wants to ask a question, please do it in the microphone because we have a couple of cameras and we want to make sure we capture everybody's voice. So can we start with our lady in back there? I think you had your hand up first. Do you want to start? And then maybe somebody else can line up right behind her as well. The next person who's going to ask a question.
Good morning. My name is Lily Liu, and thank you very much, Kitty and Maria, for this wonderful session. Wanted to ask a quick question of Professor Wong. There's a lot of talk starting already about the 2020 census. I need a 101 on why the census is important. What do you as a researcher use from census data? And then the outreach in the previous every 10-year thing. Why were they trying to reach out to each ethnic group? Why is it important? What is the key message for the 2020 census? Thank you.
So right now the 2020 census is being tested, and there's been a lot of activism around it. Why is the census important? We draw our congressional districts, we draw our political districts based on the census. So constitutionally counting the folks in this community using a census, every community, is really critical. It's also the way that elected officials and other entities make decisions about where geographically to concentrate resources, including government services, including language services. So that's why it's important. Some of us were very active in working with the census to ensure that each Asian group was counted in a way that really captured the diversity of the Asian American community. So for smaller groups like Cambodian Americans or Laotian Americans, it is really difficult to ensure that the census doesn't lump these groups together, but those are the groups that have, for instance, a 40% high school dropout rate, right? We need to know that some Asian American groups are actually struggling in terms of educational attainment. What is happening right now? There's actually a group of Asian Americans, primarily Chinese Americans, that are challenging the disaggregation of Asian American data. They don't want to collect data on different Asian American groups. To me, this is a mistake because we will not understand the needs of our community without data disaggregation. I think, to put it bluntly, this is an effort to perpetuate colorblind racism. They don't want to know the differences because they actually want to erase the kinds of needs we might have in our community. And this is something that is very serious that is happening in our community right now. There's actually a small backlash against the Asian American Civil Rights Agenda. The Asian American Civil Rights Agenda has said for 50 years, please disaggregate government and other kinds of data so that we can know where the needs are in our community, because the model minority stereotype suggests that everyone's doing fine. But there's actually some very serious needs. There's a lot of poverty, and there are also educational challenges that some Asian American groups are having, and we will not be able to detect those without data disaggregation.
And just to add to that, and I think that's an excellent answer, there are two real main reasons why we need the census and why we need the census to be disaggregated for every ethnic groups. One is for political participation. I don't mean big P politics. What I mean is government, as I said earlier, one of the most basic fundamental questions that we should be asking is, are we getting our fair share, right? We're taxpayers. We are participating in every aspect of American life, but are we getting everything that we should be getting from the government, from the private sector? And the only way you can have the baseline is to know how many of us are there, how much do we make, how much are we contributing by taxes, and what are we getting back in return? So that's the baseline. So the political participation is absolutely key. Second part of that, though, is that there are programs that will never exist. They would never exist if they didn't know that we existed. And for example, in the Voting Rights Act, as you know, in 1965, Congress passed a law that would allow for no more discrimination at the voting level. And that was obviously designed to overcome the Jim Crow laws, where they required African-American voters to have all these literacy tests and some of these absolutely unconstitutional standards. So the Voting Rights Act came in to change that. Since then, in the 80s and 90s, the Voting Rights Act was amended to allow for language discrimination. That would have never happened if the census never said, oh, by the way, how many people speak English? And that's a basic question, but they never asked that until recently. When they started asking, how many of you speak English at home? And a lot of Asian Americans said, actually, we don't speak English. A lot of Latinos said, we don't speak English at home. Then Congress acted by saying, in those places, in those counties where we don't have a lot of people that feel comfortable in English, we should maybe have ballot access in other languages as well. And so Koreans, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Hispanic, and Spanish language, obviously, are the places in particular that the language assistance came in. So even though you might have laws in the books already, the laws are not going to be customized to be delivered to our communities if our government doesn't understand our needs. And so that's why I think this aggregated data is important. Yes, sir. Nicholas.
Hi, I'm Nicholas. I'm a current Princeton student, and I'm actually here this summer with OCA. And I guess one thing I've noticed with both campus Asian American activism and with OCA's activism is that it can be really hard to organize the Asian American community, given that so many Asian Americans don't necessarily identify as Asian Americans and would rather go by ethnic subgroup. So I guess, what is your recommendation for building a more cohesive, powerful Asian American electorate, given that current level of association with the title itself?
Well, let me start. Yeah, I'll make this a simple answer because it could be a very long answer. First of all, I'm a proud paid member of OCA, Northern Virginia chapter, and that's a great organization, so thank you for being an intern. I think what we have to think about is we don't necessarily, and I tend to be a contrarian when I'm with my Asian American fellow political and civil rights groups. I tend to be a contrarian because I don't think that we as Asian Americans need a separate Asian American civil rights agenda. I think our agenda should be the American agenda. We all want the same things. We all pay taxes. We want great education. We want public safety. We want great economic opportunities, jobs, and entrepreneurship. We also want great transportation and infrastructure. And we want all these things in a safe nation and the strongest military, all these things that we all care about. The difference is we just want it to be done in a way that we, Asian Americans, feel comfortable, whether it's language access, cultural access, appropriateness, and being served in a way that will mean more to us. And so we're not here saying, these are all these things that other people care about, and then these are things that we care about. A lot of that overlap tremendously. Just that the way we talk about it is what's important. So when we talk about whether it's education or healthcare, whatever it is, we just want to make sure that our folks are the faces of the need, and our needs are specifically defined. So to the extent that there's an Asian American civil rights agenda, it's America's agenda customized and delivered to us in a way that's unique to us. And from that perspective, as much as I love the whole, Korean Americans for this, Korean Americans for that, Asian Americans for this, that's all great. That might be one way to reach out to people that don't feel comfortable joining. I think ultimately it should be sub-part of or an overlapping with the existing organization. So politically, not to be partisan here at all, but there is a group called Asian Americans for Hillary. There's also a group called Asian Americans for Trump. To the extent that we have Asian Americans that want to get involved in those campaigns, they should get involved with all of that campaign, not just the Asian American wing of that, because ultimately they'll see us as, oh, you guys only care about reaching out to Chinatown. So here, we have an event in Chinatown, you guys go over there. In the meantime, the rest of us are over here hanging out with all the real big politicians. You don't want that. You want us to be incorporated in every aspect of it, and on top of that, bring our community into that fold.
It is a challenge that diversity. Every community is diverse. So we'll see in the next census. The next census is going to allow whites, blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans to have checkoffs and to write in the national origin or other identities, so that we'll see this diversity across groups. And so it's just highlighted among Asian Americans because it is actually part of how we frame ourselves, right? At the same time, I think we're seeing some convergence around issues, and we need to think beyond the kind of stereotype. So I think a lot of political campaigns are like Asian Americans, family and education, and that's based on really the model minority stereotype. But our agenda is much broader, as Mark, I think, alludes to, which is, people don't think about Asian Americans as contributing to this broader agenda having to do with, let's say, issues like gun control, the environment, the role of government in everyday life. I think healthcare, these are issues that Asian Americans care about, but really when politicians, not Mark, think about the Asian American agenda, they kind of focus on stereotypes. They think about education and they think about immigration. And those are issues that on education, Asian Americans look like other groups in many ways. All groups are supportive of stronger education policies. There's no group in America that's like, I want a really bad public education system. And then on immigration, Asian Americans actually are not distinct necessarily on their views about certain immigration policies. They are very supportive of expanding the H-1B program. They are very supportive of expanding the number of visas that go to towards family reunification. But on the main issue of the day, which is a path to citizenship, they don't look different. So we got to look at beyond the kind of stereotype to this broader agenda. And even Asian American organizations, I think, are not necessarily mobilizing around these other issues that Asian Americans care about.
Thank you. All right. Next question, right behind you. Hi, Jen.
Hi, my name is Chen Tu. I came to the country 21 years ago. I have a comment and I have a question. So my comment is I actually totally resonate with Delegate Kim, your comment about the lack of experience on how to do it, like participate the political process. I have experience that about half a year ago, we went to Annapolis to lobby for Alex Calvin law. A group of Asian parents, they feel very, very strongly about it, but they didn't know how to do it. So I happened to have a friend who is state delegate. He taught me how to do it, and so we drove there and we did it. And then after that, they collectively told me, they said, wow, it is that simple. Mm-hmm. But they didn't know that before they went there. So I plead the community leaders like you to do more, to not just say how important it is to participate, but how, right? So it's kind of important, especially to first generation immigrant parents, because when parents, they do it, then their kids will do it, mm-hmm. right? So this is my comment. My question is totally different about the press. Mm-hmm. So I'm politically dead middle, right? Mm-hmm. But recently I found that the press has started moving to two different directions, and I can't, I myself was torn. I can't just subscribe one paper anymore. I need to do two. So it's really hard for me. My question is, do you see that trend? Second of all, do you have any, what caused this, and how do I handle it, Because right now I subscribe Washington Post and Wall Street Journal to balance myself. But it's waste my money, waste my time, right? So I just don't feel comfortable.
So why are we becoming more politically polarized? There are two things going on. One is that political districting has the way that legislatures and other entities have drawn political districts have actually created fewer and fewer competitive districts. And when you have that, then you create a dynamic in which there's the political kind of constituencies become polarized, and so there's not as much playing to the middle because there's not as many competitive districts, right? And we've definitely seen that trend over time. And then people are self-sorting also into districts that match their own political views. So that's why we see this in terms of the press. I'm not sure if there's a reflection, but I think it's pretty clear that the country is becoming more politically polarized. The actual people are not becoming as politically polarized as the district. So that's sort of important to understand.
First of all, on your first point, I thank you so much for doing what you did and going down to Annapolis. The most fun that I have as a state representative is when I see Asian Americans drive down to Richmond, in my case, Richmond, or to Annapolis, and actually lobby for their interests. It's fascinating because 99.9% of the times when I'm in Richmond for the session, I see whites, I see blacks obviously, and I see some Latinos. The only Asians I see are my interns. And so I get really excited when I see Asian Americans coming down and actually saying, hey, I need this. This is something that's really important to me. Can you vote this way on this bill or what have you? And that's a fascinating thing. That's our government. And yet we've been excluded. So I'm glad you're doing it. And I'll give you one homework. This is one of many takeaways, but I'll give it to you now. Between now and next, let's say next June, okay, beginning of summer, that gives you about 8 months or 9 months or so. Every single one of you in this room, I don't care where you live, I don't care where your home district is, you have to, by next June, know your local county person by name, city council, town council if there is, a school board member, your state rep, your state senator, your U.S. congressman, and your U.S. senators. I'm going to make it a little bit tough because I don't think you're going to know who the VP and president is going to be, at least until November. But you know who you know the other local and state folks right now. Go out there, make an appointment, see them, get to know them personally, have a five-minute sit-down conversation with every one of them or their staff, and so that by next June, you can say, I've actually personally met every single one of the people that represent me. Because that's your right and your duty and your responsibility as a voter in America to know who your elected officials are and hold them accountable. That's something everybody can do. All you have to do is pick up the phone and call and say, hey, I'd like to stop by and say hi to you because you're my representative. And if they say no, vote that person out. There's no reason in the world that anybody who represents you should say, I'm not meeting with you. Okay, so that's one homework. But just going back to your press thing, you're probably the only person that I know that actually has admitted that you subscribe to newspapers nowadays. I don't know if anybody else that actually pays for newspapers anymore. But I'll give you this advice. There is absolutely no such thing as the honest truth out there. No newspaper, no paper, no media does anything factual anymore. Everything is editorialized because reporters have biases. Editorial pages have biases. Back in the old days when I was growing up, and Rick and I probably know this from our generation, back in the old days when the Soviet Union was called the Soviet Union, they had two newspapers. One was called The News in translated, and the other one was called The Truth. And the saying was, there's no news in the truth, and there's no truth in the news. They used to say that because the only two newspapers in all of Soviet Union were run by the government. And if you got to think of it that way, I mean, the press, we use them for our purposes in politics, and you all should use it to get facts, but don't rely on them to tell you what the facts and truth are. You have to determine that on your own. So read as many different viewpoints, hear different opinions, but ultimately come down to what you believe is your core views. Don't let anybody sway you otherwise, because liberals have their agenda, conservatives have their agenda. But let's go to the last question, and then let's wrap this up. I think Ms. Winifred, is it? Yes.
My name is Winifred Watson Florence, and this has been outstanding. I really appreciate both your comments and being here. I have a concern, and that is that sometimes when I am pulling data together, I miscategorize members of the Asian American community because their names represent the names that I am most accustomed to seeing in the Latino community. Chavez, even Keam. So can you help me address how maybe you as a community can influence and inform those of us who are collecting data? I did it for AARP. I do it in educational arenas. I would really appreciate your comment and feedback on that.
So there are a number of techniques that different organizations use to categorize. There are groups out there, commercial vendors, that actually work really hard on this. And there's also groups like the Pew Research Center who do it. What people do, they first start with the last name, but you can also, because there's intermarriage and other issues, you can also look at middle names and combine that with geographic density. So using a combination of different things. You can't get it perfect because any listed name database is going to have some errors, but you can sort of create a 80% likely to be Asian, 90% likely to be Asian, not just on the last name, but looking at middle names, looking at the place of residence also to see if that's like an Asian American area.
And just a final note on that, because my last name is spelled somewhat different than most Korean Americans who spell it K-I-M, I sometimes get neglected as a non-Asian, which I understand that. But I think a lot of it has to do with self-reporting, and that's why, going back to the census question, there are now opportunities where you self-identify. Now, some people who might be Asian American just don't want to identify themselves as Asian. That's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. So you can say, hey, I'm American. I don't like this hyphenated names. Others might go out of the way to say, I'm 1/32 this, I'm 1/16 that, 1/8 this, and that's fine too. The point is, in America, we ought to define ourselves. And if you're an Asian American that wants certain benefits and programs that are catered to you, it's up to you to decide that I want to be represented. If you don't feel that you need that, then you can not self-identify. And just a couple points on this. A good friend of mine who's a member of Congress from Virginia, his name is Robert C. Scott. Most people look at him and think he's African-American, but the C in Robert C. Scott is Cortez. His grandfather is Filipino-American. He's the first part Filipino-American member of Congress in Congress, and he may be the next senator from Virginia, depending on what happens with Tim Kaine. But one of our mutual friends who just passed away last week, a very good friend of mine, his funeral is this weekend, his name is Joe Montano. You would not think that Joe Montano is an Asian American, or you'd think he's a football player, but Joe Montano is Filipino American as well. And so to the extent that last names are confusing, that is certainly an issue. But as long as you're self-identifying, and from what Janelle talked about, the different software programs and such, there are ways that we can be about 85, 90% certain about this. So let's do this. It's time for us to leave pretty soon. I think we only have this room for another 15, 20 minutes, so we need to wrap up and get out of here. But let me finally thank once again Janelle Wong. Let's give her a big hand for her wonderful project. And I just have one last thing to say, and I want to turn this over to Janelle for her comments, and then the Rose. I thought the demographic and the research paper that Janelle and her whole school, by the way, University of Maryland has a wonderful API studies program. They did a fantastic job. I encourage all of you to stay involved and interested. There are lots and lots of reports that you can get from her and from other sources. It's incumbent upon us as active leaders in the community to know about ourselves, to be able to be out there evangelizing about why we need certain things. You can't do that without data and facts, and so you need to study this stuff. So please reach out to her and the other academics. The best takeaway I got out of this, the one thing I didn't know until today when I saw the study, is about the environmental activism part of it, because I happen to do a lot of work in environmental policy. So I think my tagline out of this is, green is the new yellow.
Just say, surprise yourself with new information about our community. Get to know us first.
Thank you both for a very interesting discussion, and I feel like time was too short. A lot of us had more questions, but I think this is the beginning of a conversation and just hit the tip of the iceberg. And Mark even gave us homework to do for the coming year. But the other thing I want to just share a story of how unusual Mark is. Not only do you, as a homework, he wants you to meet with people that represent you, but he doesn't represent us in Maryland, but he has been very generous with his time in helping across the region, DC, Virginia, and Maryland, which is in direct contrast to a lot of politicians. I can say one particular friend of mine or a colleague who has worked for a congressperson told me that when you work for that congressperson, if things come in from not his constituency, so he knows they can't vote for him, he never deals with it. He just tears it up. So you could write in, even though they're the chair of a committee that you care about, foreign relations, whatever it is, and you want to tell that person something, they don't care. And I feel like knowing that story as a backdrop and seeing how Mark acts, it's a real testament to Mark's altruistic nature and really willingness to help Asian Americans from whatever walk of life. So I guess the message from that is to reach out to whoever you think can actually help you, even if they're not in your district necessarily, because there are a few still in Congress who I think are willing to do that. But we really want to thank you both, Janelle, for a wonderful presentation. A lot of preparation went into that. And we do have some parting gifts for you to give you a little bit of Princeton to take you through.
Thank you so much.
By the way, just a trivia point. You know that one of the most famous Princeton alum / affiliated persons is Woodrow Wilson, our former president. Woodrow Wilson was the last Virginian to be president of the United States, and that was a long time ago. And this year, regardless of party, regardless of which way you lean politically, just know that there might be a vice president of our region in the White House, which is the first time in at least 150 years, and so that's an exciting time for us.
And then lastly, I would also like to recognize Dora Chen, who has helped volunteer for us for the last 4 times. And we have a little memento for Dora, if you could just come up and. So even though she's a Princeton student, we think her tastes run towards People magazine. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn the mic over to Kitty, who's going to give final remarks. Thank you.
No, I want to thank Mark and Janelle again. I learned so much today, and even more than that, I am inspired. So thank you. As Mark said, continue to stay connected and be interested. I again have to thank Rose Lee. Without Rose, this series would not have been possible. I have just been thrilled with the caliber of speakers that we have and the audience. So many of us that joined us. And Stan Tai, I forgot to point out that you have been with us. APGA was part of the generation of this idea, and Stan came to, I believe, every single one of these. We're just so pleased to have you with us, and thank you again for your support. And I saw that Reggie Galloway had arrived. Reggie is with the Princeton Club of Washington and the Association of Princeton, of Black Princeton Alumni, so happy to have you with us as well. So I wanted to share another story about Mark as well. As Mark said, we go back a long way. When we were part of Leadership Greater Washington, one of the days that we spent was to visit a public school in Virginia. And at that time, they talked about how they had 70 different languages and ethnic groups in the school, and we actually met some of the students. One of them was this adorable little black boy, and he looked at, and for some reason, somebody in our group asked, well, what do you think about our group coming to visit? And this little boy looked at Mark and me and said, they're brothers and sisters. So I think that perhaps today that he would have, with the growth in Asians, he may not have drawn the same conclusion. I think the other big takeaway that I have is that the importance of balance, and that balance isn't always knowing the two opposing sides. In today's world, there's a whole lot more nuance than two polarizing sides, and I think that is one of the problems that the media tends to do, to get two opposing sides just to get different views, and we miss all of the nuance in the middle. And I think, as Janelle said so many times, that there's so much diversity among us. It's important that we understand, that we seek to learn and to understand and seek to speak with each other and to explore our differences and not polarize each other. So please, let's continue the conversation. Again, thanks to Sophia and the DSFederal-IDEA Foundation who allowed us to afford getting this professionally videotapes. Thanks again to NCC. Please do grab our videotapes, bring people together, watch them, have conversations, and have this lead on into the future. So thanks again for joining us. It's so great to be with you.